Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Observable Flutter. My name is Craig Labenz, and I'm your host. And today, I'm very excited to be joined by a special guest to talk about a very exciting topic. I won't steal his thunder to introduce himself. First, as you all know, this is the Flutter community. We've got standards for ourselves. Let's live up to them. And that's all we need to say about that. So, joining today is the one and only, the esteemed Rémi Rousselet, creator of many things, too many to enumerate here today. I'll let Rémi himself take that and say a few words. If I can find my cursor, there it is. Rémi,
Hello.
welcome back. Yeah, welcome back to Observable Flutter. Would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here again. And really excited to talk about macros. Sounds an interesting topic that I've waited for a long time to have in the Dart language.
Yeah, you've probably done as much work as anyone on the still current but soon to be old system of build runner and all of that. I think we owe South Korea a hello here. There's a lot of South Korea love in the chat, and annyeonghaseyo. Glad to see you all. So Rémi, you were saying, yeah, you have been waiting for a long time for macros. So why don't we set the stage a little bit with the state of things where they are pre-macros?
Yeah, so build runner or doing things by hand, I guess.
Right.
Should we, because that's still a common option nowadays. Do we want to explain how to use build runner or why we would use code generation?
Yeah, maybe just a little bit about code generation. I imagine most folks here are well versed, but just to ensure everyone's on the same page, I don't think we need to go into the mechanics of operating build runner specifically. But yeah, just some of the reasons why we might want some code to write other code.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much the same reason as why you would use a package or use design patterns, stuff like that. It's as application grow, it's becoming more and more important to have maintainable code to avoid bugs as much as possible and make things more testable and editable, stuff like that. And the thing is, so you might be tempted to use something like a state management package or maybe a UI library or something like that. But the thing is, there is only so much that a package can do, especially considering in Flutter, the Dart mirror API is disabled for the sake of reducing bundle size. So it's even more limited. And Dart is a statically typed language too, so it doesn't help either.
Yeah, and to dive into a little bit there about like the statically typed part and mirrors and all that, the problem that code generation is solving here is that as everyone knows who's written much software, so much of the stuff that you have to write is just glue code, boilerplate, really, really boring. Not why any of us enjoyed any of our computer science classes to the extent that we did enjoy them. And, or if, not that college or university is not the only way into this field, not why any of us just enjoy doing this job. And the idea of code generation is that this boilerplate is really error prone, really boring, and it's also actually simple. It's so simple, it's hard to turn your brain on for it all. And that's why it's error prone. So the more simple something is, the more easy it is to write code to do that thing. And so code can actually just write this code very easily. And yeah, that helps a lot. Oh, Rémi, I think, by the way, when you were just typing, I think we were hearing you type on your keys, because I think are you typing on your actual laptop keyboard?
I don't think I typed right now.
Then maybe I just heard static in my.
Oh, that might be the computer moving. Let me move it a bit. Yeah, not sure.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
guess we'll see later, but
Yeah, I'll report back if I hear any more noises. At any rate, so some languages, all languages want to solve this problem, and the extent to which a language is static really informs to what the nature of the solution will look like. The more dynamic a language, the more, sometimes even just at runtime, code can read like itself essentially and add more stuff to itself. Dart does not work that way. As Rémi mentioned, with tree shaking, if a certain function's not used, Dart doesn't even compile it into the app. So then at runtime, you could never read that function and do something with it because it's not there anymore. So Dart has to really reimagine a solution for how to write code that writes code. And the old way was build runner, and it worked, but it was pretty tedious, and macros is the thing. So that's kind of my. Oh, we've got one. I don't know to what extent we've answered this, but what is a macro? So great question, Rémi. Would you want to field that, or would you like me to?
sure. A macro is a small Dart program that takes your code as input and generates extra Dart code for it. So that, for example, if you use a macro on a specific class, it can add a toString method or maybe override the equal implementation, for example.
Yeah, so I would say a macro is actually just a specific unit of code that reads code and writes more code. And it could be big, it can be small. It is hopefully the future of code generation in Dart. Mm-hmm. And I say hopefully, so this is a pretty good time to remind everyone that macros is, as a project, quite mature. The Dart team has been working on it for years at this point. I think it probably would be out by now, but they paused it to work on records and pattern matching. And that was kind of deemed to be more foundational and more, also just safer to ship, a more understood problem. So now the focus is back on macros, and the Dart team is pretty sure they're doing something that no other language has done in the world before.
Yeah.
And so this means that there are some unknowns, and the actual delivery of the project is not yet a guarantee because of unknowns within developer experience that we'll get into.
That's probably something we didn't quite mention in the definition of what is a macro. Is it's not your typical code generator. It's completely different from build runner in that it's directly built in the Dart compiler. So for example, there is no separate tool to have the macro generate extra logic for your application. And it's also really fast, really, really fast. It's like milliseconds.
Right. A lot of, some definitely good questions in the chat here. This is a great one and quite philosophical. How are macros different from Mason bricks? Would you like to fill that, or would you like me to, Rémi?
Yeah. If you want to go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So a Mason brick is a template of code that is done at development time, whereas, by the way, macros are happening at compile time. So that's already one difference. Development time, just when you're typing, versus compile time. And a Mason brick is a file that is essentially used as a template. I believe the actual templating protocol almost is Mustache. And you use the CLI to invoke Mason and supply values that are then essentially, you supply values that are then applied to the templates, and it just stamps out files onto your computer, and then, or into your file system, into your code base. And then those files that have been generated are completely disconnected from the generation process. So they're now yours to edit, and you treat them just like normal files. So you might use Mason to generate your empty blocks or Riverpod providers and your empty widgets and maybe your route and all the just kind of boilerplate when you set out to add a new feature in your app. And so it kind of gets you to this hello world state for how you like to set stuff up. But then you now treat those files like normal completely. Macros is different because it reads code at compile time. It can also be at analysis time, actually. Now that I'm really thinking about it, saying compile time is not quite precise enough. This is happening as you're typing. So really, I guess they're both happening as you're typing. And they generate files that you never touch. You never actually own those files. They're completely managed by Dart and the Dart VM and the macros system, but they've read code that you wrote. They apply the algorithm to that code. They spit out more code, but you never own that file. You can read it, you can debug it, you can understand it, all that good stuff, but it's never actually like your file. So if you typed in it, that's a bad idea. You don't do that. Anything that you would add to that, Rémi?
Yeah, I would say in a sense, Mason bricks kind of are similar to the Flutter create command, but for custom logic. And the thing is, when you use Flutter create, say you wanted to rename your application, Flutter create doesn't handle renaming. You would have to maybe update the files manually or delete them and regenerate stuff, which can be very tedious. Whereas with something like macros, it doesn't just the flow is different, such that if you were to rename something in your project, the generated code associated to that object would also be updated automatically. So it's easier to maintain over time, which is one of the main reasons why we use code generation. Because generally, often writing code the first time is easy. The difficulty is then to update the code afterward. That's when we tend to make mistakes.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Continuing to read all these great questions. This one, there's a lot to this question. What is unique about the Dart macros? I teased that Dart is doing something that no other language has ever done before. And Rémi, you've used them much more than I have. Do you have an answer up your sleeve? How you think about what is unique about Dart macros?
Pretty much everything, I would say. I don't think there is something similar in any other language. In a way, I would say it's kind of like if you could enhance the compiler on your own. So like compiler logic, but download it from a package. So you can download extra language features, which is super interesting. Obviously, you have some restrictions about what you can generate or not, but that's a very interesting way. For example, a macro is able to generate custom compilation errors, which is not something you could do with Builder, for instance.
Yeah, downloading more compiler tricks is a really interesting way to put that. Yeah. I think also, aside from the features that macros unlock, the developer experience that the Dart team is going for, and the sheer just the speed at which they are hopefully going to execute, right? Flutter apps get big, and there's going to be macros on widgets, and our apps define a lot of widgets, and there will be macros in the framework. If macros work, and if they're good and they're fast enough, they're going to be in the framework. So every keystroke, there's a lot of stuff going on. And this needs to basically happen between you pressing one key and the next key, because that's how fast the Dart analyzer works. So something like 200 milliseconds is the budget for the macros system to reanalyze your whole project constantly. And that's pretty crazy. No other language is doing that. So yeah, those are just some of the things that make macros pretty unique. Okay, just so many more good questions. Rémi, do you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I wanted to also add that in other languages, I guess the equivalent in many cases to not use code generation, but mirroring or something similar.
Yeah, runtime
So I
reflecting.
guess in the end, the difference in outcome would be performance and bundle size. Maybe you could, and maybe more static errors instead of runtime errors.
Right, and perfect segue into this question, which is exactly where I wanted to go next. Hassan asks, would macros allow for static analysis of the code, or would we face runtime errors, or are there different pipelines for resolving this? And yeah, Rémi, you want to continue? You were just hitting on this.
Yeah. So yeah, macros, like I mentioned before, enable writing custom compilation errors. You can't write any error, but there are many things you can do with custom errors, and warnings too. You actually also can write warnings, which is interesting. So you could have custom static checks, and as opposed to if you were using mirroring, for instance, those errors would be at runtime instead. So in that sense, yes, it's way more static.
All right, I'm trying to catch up on chat here, make sure I get all the really great questions starred. There's so many. Okay, back. Oh, which one should we go with next? There's a lot about just kind of what does this mean? What will the arrival of macros mean for us writing apps? So this question, is this going to make model maintenance easier? Is this going to change state management? Questions in this regard. So Rémi, how do you see just the everyday Flutter developer who doesn't write their own macro feeling the impact of their arrival?
Yeah, basically, the point of macros is that it enables package authors to implement features that would otherwise not have been possible without using macros or maybe build runner, because a big part of the community today doesn't want to use build runner, for instance, because it's slow.
It's really slow. It's so slow.
Yeah. So what you can expect from macros is slightly change the way you've been doing things before. For example, add an annotation on your class, and then you get maybe extra debugging on your errors. For example, instead of just a random error, you have a much more specific error because extra genetic information, because the macro was able to generate extra information to help debugging. You can have better error messages. You can have better developer experience because you don't have to implement an equal yourself. Overall, packages will be more powerful.
Now, one thing I kind of want to get to here is so you obviously wrote freezed, which I would estimate, without having looked at any numbers, is the most broadly used code generation package in Dart currently, and that is a stat that I just made up. But
it's probably JSON serializable, I would say.
Yeah, that could be true. Yeah, especially since I doubt many people use freezed without JSON serializable. So that's a good point.
Exactly.
So maybe you sit merely in second place. But right, the point for anyone who's used either JSON serializable alone or freezed with it, right? The point of this is you have this extremely minimal declaration yourself, and then something else, right? Either the JSON serializable code, the freezed code, or in the future macro code will know how to read that minimal declaration, interpret what it's supposed to communicate, and then expand that minimal declaration into a much broader implementation. Right? That's kind of what code generation does. That's why freezed is so great. So when you were, when you were using, you were writing freeze and then rewriting it, and the package, by the way, is called data class or data
Yeah,
classes.
I renamed it recently.
Oh, what's it called now?
Yeah, it's data class.
Oh,
It
okay.
used to
All
be
right. All right.
freeze. It used to be a dev flag on the freeze package. At the moment, it's data class.
Okay. So I'm going to pull this up. Packages, data. Is it singular? Data class? Yeah, there
Yes.
we go. All right. I'm going to put this in. Now, okay. Also, how stable? Like, should people use this, or is it crazy to use data class?
I mean, the language feature isn't stable, so obviously it cannot be stable.
Yeah. So if you want to look at the implementation and see how it's done, this is the package. But you'd have to be out on the master branch, and you'd have to be willing for your app to break at any point after you run Flutter upgrade on the master branch, because the macros feature is not stable and there's no promises. So I wouldn't use it. But if you want to read this code and kind of understand what the experience is like of building this system that ingests that minimal declaration and it adds on a broader implementation, like that's where the new version of Freeze currently lives. Okay, so we do have one brave Evil Knievel in the chat who says they're already using it. Good luck to you, Manish. I wish you the best. All right, I'm flagging a few more good questions. Let's get another one up here. Oh, I clicked the wrong button. Okay, couple questions about rewriting and the portability of Build Runner to macros. So I'll bring this one up, which can represent this whole idea of the migration path from Build Runner to macros. Remy, could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Why would we migrate from Build Runner to macros? The answer is straightforward. Macros have a way better developer experience. So to provide better developer experience to our users, obviously we want to provide macros for them instead of Build Runner. Now, the migration path isn't simple. Migrating freeze to Build Runner effectively is a rewrite of the project. Maybe not the tests. I was able to keep most of my tests because of the way I wrote them initially. But outside of that, you can expect most of the logic to be rewritten.
Yeah, there is essentially not a migration path insofar as like your Build Runner.
You can preserve some things like the well, I was about to say the generated code would look similar, but I guess since now we also have augmentation libraries, which is not macros, but a new feature associated with macros. And so augmentation libraries enable so many new different things for code generation. So code writers will also want to migrate to that. But yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think the migration path is just taking you've learned a lot. If you've written a Build Runner package, you've learned a lot already about writing a code generator, and that will help you with macros, or porting your thing to macro or the macro system. But beyond that, I don't think it's not like when Dart added null safety and there was a tool that tried to solve 70% of your issues and just leave you the tricky 30%. Like I don't think there's going to be anything like that. Okay, I just saw a great question. What was it? Oh yeah. Okay, so we've teased concerns about the developer experience and the speed and whatnot. This is a great question. What about the readability of the code that sits behind these macros? Like obviously with Build Runner, it just stamps out a file. It sits right there. You can open it up. You can if there's a problem, you can just read the generated code and understand what's going on. You can put a breakpoint in there. Remy, what is it like for both macro authors and app authors using macros?
It's quite a lot of things here. Could you keep showing the question, by the way?
Just yeah, absolutely.
So that I remember everything.
Yep.
Yeah, because for the app developers aspect of things, the way I would view it is you should view the annotations you put on your classes and stuff like that similar to kind of like the async keyword on a function. So my view of macros is, generally speaking, you probably don't need to read the generated code. You mostly need to care about the class that generated code instead. So even if the generated code is not that super readable, it's not that big of a deal. Generally, if you need to read that code, that generated code, it's because there's a bug in the macro, and so at that point you should raise an issue on the macro package. As for the macro author perspective, the experience here is pretty good. You can change the source of your macro and see in a matter of milliseconds the outcome of that change. Kind of like if you had a hot reload on Flutter. So it's very fast. There is a very fast development cycle. I haven't seen a way to connect to the Dart debugger at the moment. So we have been debugging things so far is generating comments inside the generated code, kind of like prints, but inside the generated code, which has been fine for me so far. So I'm pretty satisfied. I think the developer experience when working with macros is way better than what we've had with BuildRunner. And I actually would argue that BuildRunner was actually already pretty good in terms of developer experience for writing code generators. So it's really, from my perspective, writing macros is really good.
Yeah, the biggest problem with build runners was just for big projects with lots of declarations. It was, I've heard people, whenever they need to actually rerun the build runner, they like go on lunch break because it takes that long. It takes half an hour.
Yeah.
An hour.
I mean, I wish we went a bit further with BuildRunner, but since we're working on macros now, it's probably not worth it to investigate. But I'm pretty sure there are many ways to improve performance with BuildRunner.
One person just mentioned, by the way, I saw that that data class package was last updated 3 years ago. You're going to want to look at the preview release. That is that's where that's at.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question that relates to kind of what we were just getting at. A forecast of when macros will be in the stable channel. So you're hearing kind of some of the rough edges around this, like the debugging and Dart, the Dart dev tools aren't fully hooked into this yet. That's not an acceptable developer experience for the shipped product. So that's just one of the reasons why it's still in development and still only on master and only available for preview for the bravest of souls, you know, and whatnot. There's also questions about how fast this will be. The framework team is experimenting with some widgets right now, or sorry, some macros to apply to widgets right now, like literally to stateful and stateless widget. And that is also going to, that's going to really stress test the performance of these things. So there's a lot of moving parts yet, and sadly, the forecast that I can give is that there is no forecast. But the team is working incredibly hard on it, and my understanding is it's essentially the top goal for the Dart team right now. One little kind of X's and O's question here. We mentioned augmentation and how that's a new concept in Dart that isn't strictly about macros, but it's definitely related to macros. Can you explain augmentation?
I think you could view augmentations as kind of defining a class or a function in multiple places at once. So you define it at the source the source of truth is the class that's annotated by the macro, but then the macro can add extra bits to that class. And so it's kind of similar to if you were using part files before with build runner, but when you use build runner, you often have to do that extends $$ your class name to enable the contributor to add extra stuff to their class. That basically is the same thing, but without having to do that $$ my class.
Yeah, it's essentially a new way to say this code and that code go together.
Also, I guess another way of looking at it would be it's kind of like extension, static extension, but not as a separate not as defined from outside of the class, but directly built in the class. So it's more powerful than static extensions.
Oh, by the way, I just realized I forgot to do this. So now we have our background. Now we're not just floating in the void. Some folks are asking about some live coding and showing macros happen. And maybe, Remy, we should do that soon to help everyone anchor all these things that we're talking about. So I'm going to hit one more question here, and then maybe we can show a macro happening, and then we'll go back to questions, and hopefully that helps. And this question that I'm doing before is related to it. So great question here. Confused about one point. Since you don't own the code that's generated by the macro, what do you do if you need to modify part of it? And is there a workaround?
You don't. You pretty much don't modify the generated code. Instead, you modify the class that generates the code, so the class that's annotated, and the outcome of the code generation would be different. So in the scenario where the macro doesn't offer a way to do what you want, you might have to either raise an issue on the macro package to suggest a new feature, or maybe fork the macro to implement it yourself.
Yep. There's, it's similar to using just any other library, right? If you add something to your pubspec file, you don't own any of the code in that either. Obviously, you could fork it and install it from your own fork on Git, and now you control it. But it's still the same. Like, you don't really control that code. And a macro is different from a library. You download a library, you basically download a bunch of functions, and those are completed projects, or completed like artifacts, completed things that you can invoke. With a macro, you're downloading a different kind of function, and the input of the function is some code that you write, and the output of the function is more code that you execute. But you still don't own that function. Oops, I'm bumping things. You still don't own that function, and so transitively, you don't own what it outputs. And exactly like Remy said, if you have a problem with any of that, that's just like having a problem with any other package. And so, yes, an issue, a bug fix, maybe, can you submit a PR yourself? Like, all those kinds of workflows would be the workaround if a macro that you did not write starts to misbehave or whatnot. Okay, Remy, are you ready to share your screen and do a little typing?
Of course.
Okay. And if you're typing, which I think it is going to, would you mind just switching your microphone input to your headphones, which I know is the opposite of my pre-stream advice, but I think all of your keystrokes are going to come through.
Yeah. Let me do that in a second. Better.
You don't sound as good, but I don't think we're going to hear you type as loudly, so we're going to have to live with it.
I guess we'll see.
Oh, yeah, you're good. Yeah, you sound fine.
Is that bad?
It's much better than it was before. This'll do.
Perfect. Yeah, maybe not want to change that line, but sure. Excellent.
Okay, so to start, here, what are we looking at?
It's the source code of the I mentioned that I've worked on porting trees to macros. So what the file you saw previously was the source code of the macro port. So that's how trees now works using macros. The file here that I've opened right now, this one is just the example. So it's using that add data that I implemented, and it generates code. So I can go to the generated code by clicking on Go to Augmentation, which is here. And now we see the generated code for that class we defined here. So we can see it generates a few fields, generates a copy with method, and some toString, write equal, and some hash code.
Yeah, and a couple things, if you go back to that generated code.
Yeah, let's keep it here. Yes.
So it's not the most pleasant thing to read, but one thing I would say is I think we'll all get totally used to reading this kind of code, and our eyes will get accustomed to glossing over all of the noise, right? Like the prefix 0, prefix 1.
Yeah.
We're going to understand, all of our brains will get better at just being like, oh, I know what that means. Prefix 1, yeah, that points to the library that I was writing.
To
And
be
it seems like,
fair, a lot of those prefixes are likely going to disappear. I've seen some issues about not adding a prefix if it's not necessary. For example, like prefix 0 dot string, really not needed because it's coming from Dart itself. So the macro might generate just string directly. But yeah, of course, it's still experimental, so the outcome might change over time. And like I mentioned before, it's not like you're supposed to actually read this code often. You should expect this code to work anyway.
Yeah, and there's an interesting tension there. If you tell someone a bunch of code will be generated, but you're not supposed to read it, it's like, well, then how do I know how to use it? And that is where ideally just package documentation will tell you these are the things that this package can generate, and when you write A, you get B. You don't have to worry. You don't have to read B. Just know if you want it, write A, and then call it.
Yeah, it's like when you use Riverpod today. You don't care about how Riverpod is implemented. You just use it.
Now, this is an interesting question, and we're looking right at some of the generated code. So Hussein asks, can it be more performant than regular code? And it is regular code. So
I would say yes, and I would say kind of yes, depends, because technically speaking, it's normal code. The thing is, my view on it is by using code generation, the code generator might be willing to generate code that's using special optimization patterns that would be less maintainable. So, for example, if you use manual code, you likely would want to abstract stuff in using various design patterns that might add some small overheads. Whereas using code generation, the compiler, the macro might be able to do special optimizations in those cases that would otherwise not be doable by hand, at least not on a scalable way. So in some sense, it can enable performance optimizations, but by default, there shouldn't be any difference. So it's up to the macro to do those optimizations.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. I hadn't really thought about that, but that's absolutely true. And the scale of those performance gains is, depends on how hot the code is and a lot of various factors. But yeah, there's some weird tricks. Slow apps hate this one weird trick. There's some ways that you can write code in not as obvious of styles that really lend themselves to the compiler inlining things and stripping out a little bit of extra work. And yeah, those ways are often not super readable, and so we don't write them by hand. But you're exactly right that a macro could do that. Yeah, Luke pointing out that and I totally agree with this, Luke. Just fundamentally, it's not required that the macro code be super approachable and understandable and whatnot, but I will want to get my hands on it and just look at it. And, like Vader says to Luke at the end of Return of the Jedi, I would look on you with my own eyes. Like, I want to see it myself. I want to know how it works. But that's maybe just academic interest on my part.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a good thing to be able to read it. And like we saw before, it's just one click away. You just click on go to augmentation and you see the generated code.
Yep. Gosh, so many great questions. This is a nice philosophical one. Are there any security concerns when it comes to macros, since the generated code is possibly hard to parse? Any thoughts on that, Rémi? I have a lot of thoughts,
I
but I'll
guess
let you go first.
there are two different concerns. So for the generated code itself, I would say it's probably not different from your using any other package. Because like if you're using say rootbot, I could potentially have some not so secure, not so great code in the rootbot implementation. The other aspect is about how the macro is implemented. Because macros technically have access to some source files on your developer computer. So there are some questions about it's still up to discussion at the moment on the language repository. But for example, a macro might be able to read some files, but only inside the lib folder, or maybe only at the level of the path.yml. It's not necessarily clear. But that could possibly raise some concerns. I'm sure the language team is working hard on making sure that there is no issue here. And for information, with build runner generators could do all the issues you could possibly think of with this approach, and way worse considering they have full IO access anyway.
Yeah, one thing I would just say to remind all of us is when we run code that someone else wrote that we didn't read, there's always a security concern.
Yeah.
And we've all just accepted that risk. But yeah, the Dart team certainly wants to minimize that by, not letting it read your root folder, and stuff like that. This is an interesting question. Can I generate code other than Dart? And I'm happy to take it if
It depends. I'm not sure whether that will be feasible once the future is stable. But like I mentioned, there are some what's the word, specs with regards to macros being able to read files and also being able to write files. And so you could design a macro that write a JSON file if that API lands. So technically speaking, depending on what lands and what doesn't, yes or no, we don't really know yet.
Yeah, there is that uncertainty with macros, and in some sense, you're just throwing strings together. So yeah, you could put JavaScript, you could put Python. The actual macro code, and maybe we should look at some of the actual macro code as well, Rémi.
Yeah, because like I
It's
mentioned,
assembling strings.
The issue here is about what the macro API offers. At the moment, I believe only writing Dart code is implemented. I don't think you can write custom files. Maybe you can, but I haven't. I see that it's still being implemented in the language repository.
Yeah. So I pulled your screen back up. Would you mind
Yeah.
kind of going deep into the place where you're assembling that augmented class? I'd love to actually see that myself.
So macro here, the annotation we see here, it's this class, as we can see with the macro keyword, which is a keyword special to macros. And then you have to, this is a bit annoying, this pop-up. You have to implement type of macro you're going to use. So here I'm implementing class declaration macro, which is for macros that are applied on classes and that want to declare some things. So like, for example, if you want to generate a new class, you might want to use a class declaration macro. Yeah, so that's for the class. So we can take parameters here if you wanted to. I can mention here. There are some parameters here that we can use as usual. And then the core of the logic is in this build function. So depending on which interface you implement, that build function might be slightly different. But generally, it takes the annotated element as parameter and then some form of builder, which has different methods based on the interface implemented. And that builder enables you to do things like maybe declare in library. So by doing that, you can write code in the library. So for example, if I go on the generated code of that person class here, I could, for example, add a comment on top of that class by just doing declare in library, declaration code, just string is fine. From string, I think. Yeah. And I could say maybe hello world. Here.
And as you're typing here, it's showing up on the right.
Yeah, which is awesome.
Yeah.
So hello world. So now we see the comment here, and I can modify it, and we see it live, which is amazing.
Right. So folks had asked a bunch of you actually, and all great questions about the performance difference between this and Build Runner. Keystroke speed for this is
what's amazing is that it's not just keystroke speed for app users; it's also keystroke speed for macro developers. Because I would accept if like changing the source of a macro as a few seconds of downtime because you're changing the source of the macro. That's special, but it's still really fast.
Right. Yep. Yeah, I think it's funny how you say that. I haven't thought about this, but I'm pretty sure they're just the exact same flow, which is why you're getting the same experience that end developers will get.
I mean, not necessarily, because I believe one of the things with macros is that they're generated. Because like, say you publish a package that uses a macro, the generated code isn't generated at the time of publishing your package. It's instead generated at the moment when the user will run their application or when they inspect the, or when they open their IDE and then the analyzer shows authentication and that. And so the thing is with macros, there are kind of like two main different environments. There is the case where macros are running inside analyzer, and then when macros are running inside the compiler. Because like here, the code we see here is generated by analyzer, not by the compiler. So this is a fun fact. It matters because I believe there are maybe some differences in some cases. There are some. The language team is making sure that generated code isn't usually different when you're using the IDE versus when you're compiling your code, but I believe it's technically possible that the environment might be different, and so the code produced might be slightly different.
Oh, interesting. I'm not going to lie. I don't know about those details. Obviously, as this feature nears completion, it will become my official job description to know the feature inside and out, but that day has not yet arrived.
It might not even be still true by the time it's released.
Right. Okay, this is not terribly related to macros, but I did think it was quite funny. Usama, imagine coding a C++ project like a ninja, but it's actually Dart deep inside. And what really tickles me about that is that's what Flutter is, but inverted. We're writing a bunch of Dart code, and then the engine in the middle is C++. So quite funny. All right, there's so many good questions still. I loved this one. Felix asks, can macro generated code itself include a macro?
I think so. Yes, that's the goal. That's one goal. But obviously, I don't think you can use any macro. there is this concept of stage at the moment in the current implementation of macros. And I believe macros should only generate also macros from the next stage. We might have to come back to this because it's a complex topic, so maybe not mentioned it here, but the answer should be yes.
Yep, I agree. That's what I've heard from the mouths of the horses building this. For some reason, that's an English idiom, from the horse's mouth. I don't know why we say that. Macros is not actually being written by horses. But Waltert9 just had the biggest brain thought I've ever heard of. And the answer to this, I believe, is no, but this is a big brain question. Could a macro create another macro? And I do not believe that is the case. Maybe if like in the first stage you built one that only got used.
Oh yeah,
in a
I
second
think
stage.
That's the same question as before. I don't think it's actually generated a new generating a macro class. I think it's about in the generated code have an annotation. So for example, here I could do some add JSON serializable. That's I think what's referred to here.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they were referring to. I read the question a different way, but it doesn't matter. We can just address both. Yes, a class generated by a macro can itself use another macro. So that, yes, that's in the spec. That is the goal of macros. And it doesn't actually matter if this is what they were asking, but now the question is in front of us because that's how I read it. Separately, could a macro output code that is actually like the code on the left right now?
Yeah, I wonder. I'm not sure. I've never tried. I assume yes, because I don't think all macros are compiled at the time you do stuff. I think they're compiled lazily, so I assume that might work. I'm not sure. We'll have to try.
We've got one vote against it, but something tells me Sukma here is you're probably onto something, but I not terribly researched yet, but you might be right. A gut feeling from Sukma that would not go well.
Yeah,
You'd
I
really
don't see
be
the
needing.
point of doing that anyway.
Yeah, they're already so powerful. I'm not sure what it would mean. It's actually, I think, quite a challenge to come up with a non-contrived example of where you would need that, which doesn't mean it wasn't. You just daisy chain macros.
Yeah,
you just have like a tree of macros.
Especially considering a macro can generate code that uses a macro, you probably don't need to define new macros. You just define the extra macros that you might need. You define them in your package, and then when you need them, you import them in the generated code. That's usually going to do the trick. There is no reason to generate a new macro.
Yeah, there's they're just already the concept of when you would need a macro, right, is when you understand a problem very, very well. We probably shouldn't be spending this much time on this, but I think it's interesting actually, philosophically. You have a problem that you understand very well, and the inputs are very simple, and the outputs are very verbose and tedious, but like also simple. Right. That's kind of the situation where you would use a macro. So if you introduce into that a macro that is not just applying another macro, that's straightforward, but generating another macro. It's like a situation whose inputs are simple and whose outputs are a situation whose inputs are simple and whose outputs are complicated, verbose. And I think you just solve all of that in the first place with the macro, with the one macro. But fun to think about and to try to articulate, as I just attempted to do. Oh, we got a little history lesson here from Andy. From the horse's mouth, this silly British English idiom comes from British horse racing because the presumed ideal source for racing tips would be the horse itself rather than spectators or riders. So if you want to know which horses to bet on, you go look at the horses. and you don't listen to anyone else who looked at the horses. Makes sense. Rémi, are there any other code pieces here that you'd like to show as I continue to kind of trawl the question or scan the chat for questions?
I guess we can dive into those two objects. The two objects here we see is, like I mentioned, the first one is information about the annotated element. So since the macro we have here is applied on classes, we have a class declaration, and inside that class declaration, we can find information about the class. So for example, we can see whether the class is abstract, whether it's implementing specific interfaces, can find the annotations applied on it. You can obtain more information by using Builder too. You can request for the methods of the class. So I believe it's method, yeah, something like that. Methods of class, and then you get a list of methods, the fields, and other things, constructors. Essentially, the builder object is used to generate code. So like I mentioned here before, this builder generates the following code here. We can also, because here is the declaring library function, just write code in the file as is. But you might also want things like add code inside. Say you wanted to declare a new field on the person class. You might not want to just type it as is in the main file. You could do builder.declare in type, and then write your code in here. Obviously, this isn't going to be valid. Let's maybe make it a comment. Ooh, beautiful.
You broke the universe.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Well, I guess we can see those examples. By typing this, it generated the following code. Basically, our command is inserted inside the augment class. You could technically write the augment class yourself. Like, if you wanted to, you could write augment class person, blah blah blah. You could do that, but it's the builder does a bunch of stuff for you. It's way more convenient to use those utilities, this type of utility, if you want to override a method, because then when you augment the method, you would have to define all the method parameters, and it can be tedious. Whereas using such an utility, it would define the parameters for you. Obviously, that's very niche knowledge, but here we go. What else? Yeah, I guess this one is interesting too. This logic here is, for example, in freelist. Let's check. This one already.
So CTOR there is that constructor.
Yeah.
We've got super CTOR.
Yeah. Just thinking about the error message, but otherwise we'll have to, I guess, wing it. What the completion wanted to say wing, so let's go with that. Say, let's check for a second as while I'll come up with something else. But we have an error? I guess not. Let's do a custom error.
So you're trying to show the debugging experience of writing macros right now?
No, not debugging. Capabilities that we have with macros. Here, I'm generating a custom error in the generated code. Let me remove that extends wing. Here, as you can see here, this code here generates this error here. See, have the message here, I can change it, like hello world, and it says hello world.
Oh, and so is this designed to help an app author who's using this macro
Yeah,
give
for
you
example,
the things that the macro expects?
yeah, exactly. If you make a typo, for example, say you wanted to write a class, say you wanted to use Riverpod using concatenation, and you want to make the provider serializable somehow. I don't know. It's just rambling here. Maybe the macro want to show an error if you didn't have a toJSON method. And so if that method is missing, you will see an error here with a message that says, hey, there is no toJSON method. Do you want to define one? And I believe you can also change the location on where that message is located. By default, it's placed on the annotation, but you can place it somewhere else using parameters. Where is it? Is it on message? Here, yeah, target. Diagnostic target. That what is here? I don't remember. Oh yeah. Let's say we want to have it on the class name. Class dot class target, I think, as diagnostic target. We can pass the class and do as diagnostic target, and now the error appears here. Okay. We could show an error on the method if we wanted to. So say I define the method here. We could first obtain the methods. Well, so there we go, we get the methods. And then show the method on the error on the first method. That first method, we have it here.
Oh.
And then the other interesting aspect of this is here, I used methods.first, but if you apply the macro on the class that doesn't have methods, that first throws an exception. It's not legal.
Right. So the first thing you do is check if the method
there is a bug in
empty.
the macro. Normally you would use first of no or something like that. But there is a bug in the macro at the moment. And so it's throwing an exception, and you can actually see the exception inside the macro here. So with the stack trace, and you can click on it, and all. So that's interesting too. Obviously, that's for macro authors here, but to make bug reports better. But this one is more interesting: the capability of raising errors wherever you want.
Yeah, I think the end developer experience there will be pretty incredible, or can be pretty incredible, at least a high ceiling on that.
And you can make
experience.
it a warning too if you wanted to. The only downside is I've seen people ask whether you could use this as a way to implement custom warnings as packages, like instead of maybe custom lint, which is a package I made before. The problem with this is you need to use an annotation to be able to see those lints, those warnings. And the problem is, in many cases, custom warnings don't involve a custom annotation, so there wouldn't be a way to write this code. So you would still need custom links,
annotate like all their
yeah,
stuff.
Yeah, that would be awkward to start adding random annotations to enable lints on a class. It would be a bit weird, but it's nice that we can do it. And also, macros don't necessarily have all the necessary information to implement all the lints. Because, for example, if I were to do if false in here we have a warning that says dead code because this is always false. So anything in here will never be executed. The thing is, macros
can't read the bodies of function.
Yeah, at the moment they don't know what the content of the method is. Macros might be able to do that in the future. There are some discussions around it, and I would personally love to be able to do it, but for now they can't. So again, you would need an actual analyzer plugin for custom warnings.
Yeah, the ability to read a function would be obviously extremely powerful, but also extremely wild, you know.
We can do that using Analyzer. The main concern, I believe, is about the
Oh, sorry,
API
I mean,
surface. Because I believe the concern from the language team, of course, that's just my understanding, is doing that might make it harder to add new features to Dart, because then you might, if you have this API, when you add a new feature, that might cause breaking chance in the macro plugins, stuff like that. Again, of course, that's still experimental and tip of the edge.
yeah, I was thinking specifically about a macro that could read the body of a function and potentially alter that body of, that function body would be
I don't think that would ever be
wild.
possible like that. Macros never alter the annotated code. For example, if I print here, a macro will not be able to change this code, but it will be able to override this code in the sense it's kind of like if you were to subclass person, like person,
An override method,
here
yeah.
you can override the method here. You get a point. Like if I were to do extends person, you can always do that, but you cannot from the person, you cannot change this code here.
Yep. Yeah, and that makes me, that feels more balanced. And I personally have a Python
Yeah.
background, and this feels like a Python decorator, and that's just that's
And
comfortable. It's
so,
cozy.
for example, you could define a function here, function, and you could have a macro that generates custom code around that function. So of course you would have an annotation, but here I'm going to write the generated code directly in here. So for example, you could do augment function here, and in here I believe that's augmented the keyword, which you can call here to do like before, after here. Say we write a main that calls function. What we would see is we would see before, then hello,
Then
and
after.
then after.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that will I love those kind of function level. Yeah, again, they're called decorators in Python. I don't know if we'll adopt that word here for just a little wrapper that invokes the super and then does whatever, it could do some pre-work, post-work. I think those kinds of things are super helpful. Rémi, there's probably two aspects of this testing. A hex code verde, so green, and that is the hex code for green. This is a high concept account. I love it. Asks, what about testing for macros? So both writing a macro and writing writing software that uses a macro. How have you found the testing experience?
Yeah. It depends on how you write your tests. Like I mentioned before, when I ported freeze to macros, I was able to keep all of my existing tests. But the reason I was able to do that is because I'm using kind of integration tests. Basically, instead of testing, for example, can we go here? Instead of testing, if maybe no, let's go in a test instead. One way you could think about testing macros is you could do maybe you would expect something like expect some function which generate code that looks like this. You might want to generate a code that a test that I'm struggling. You might want to write a test that expects that the generated code looks like a specific way, but from my experience, that's fairly brittle. So the way I'm typically doing stuff instead is I'm using the macro. So I could, for example, use a specific feature of the macro. I could define a class that uses a macro in a certain way, and then I expect that the generated code works. So for
Yep.
example, if I want the person to implement equal, I could do person equals person.
Yep.
Yeah. And
This
this
is the
way you
true. We
still test the
are.
generated code because there is nothing in here, but you don't depend on how the code is generated.
I gotta
And
say,
so
Remy, you're making a lot of philosophers happy here. All people are created equal. There it is. You did it. But yeah, there's a principle around this. Test the behavior, not the implementation. And
yeah.
macros are going to make. They're going to bring that concept into focus. More than I think
Yeah.
everyday code.
Because I wrote a lot of contributors over the years, and one of the early contributors I wrote was called functional widget, and that's one of the mistake I made when writing functional widget. I wrote the first kind of test, the one where you test expect that it writes a class with specific fields. But the thing is, whenever you change anything inside um,
The
the
generator.
how the contributor works, you suddenly have to rewrite all the tests, and it's horrifying. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm quite happy how I do it nowadays. Like I mentioned, all of my tests are using this pattern, and everything you see here. Oh, sorry. Everything you see here is pretty. Sorry. Those are tests that were implemented using Freeze, using Bill Runner, and that just were ported over when using macros.
Yep. The power of testing the behavior and not the implementation. Hans, this goes back, I believe, to the function level decorator. And Hans says that would be awesome for refreshing auth tokens and network requests. Yeah, all kinds of stuff like that, where you just have to do some kind of pre or post validation. An area that I've wanted this the most, think about like a server side function, an endpoint that needs to validate correctness or just needs to assert the validity of all the parameters that came in. Is this API key not empty, not an empty string, not of this, not of that, and some decorators for that kind of code, man, it's going to make the task of writing those applications so much easier, and I'm really, really excited for it. Remy, I think we've hit all the questions in the chat, and this demo has been, well, it seemed thorough and enlightening to me. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share before we maybe wrap up?
Think for a second. Yeah, I guess I saw the comment pop up a few times in the chat. Of course, you can expect me to migrate my different packages to macros, at least for the relevant ones. And I'm sure many package authors in the ecosystem will also do the same. I'm sure you can expect the Dart ecosystem to change quite a bit once we have macros to improve packages.
Yeah, the concept of whether or not macros will work with a given package or concept that any of us enjoy using is like, the answer is just yes. Will it work? Yes. Will a given package author take on the extra work of doing the porting? Like, maybe not. And one thing that I would say to all of us is, don't berate any package authors who don't immediately or ever port their package to macros. Like, let's all remember that we're using their free time for our benefit. There was someone in the class, oh yeah, here in the chat. I really enjoyed this question, even though I didn't get to it earlier. Remy, they're just saying, like, you give so much to the community. Like, this person's checking on your well-being. Like, do you ever feel overwhelmed with all these maintenance and user expectations? How I don't actually want to put you on the spot for this, but I appreciate this question in this sentiment because, yeah, it's a lot. All of us, me personally, has benefited so much from Remy's free time. And so some of these packages are going to be using macros on day one, and some are not. And the ones that are not, like, we could submit PRs, right? We can help. You can fork. Like, there's solutions other than giving authors a hard time. And so I would just remind all of us about that. I think very, very important that for the Dart community, we pick each other up and help authors that are feeling fatigued from their maintenance burden, and not just kind of beat them back down. Oh, I love this. With great macros comes great responsibility. This summer, Dart developers are writing macros. Rated R. All right. Remy, a lot of love from everyone, myself included. Well, I like this one too. In Freezed, we trust. Guys are coming in hot here. Hans, who did you think you were dealing with? Come on. This is it's 101 stuff here. I'm biggest nerd there is. Remy MVP, Remy big up. Yeah. Remy, thank you so much from the entire Flutter community. I don't think it'd be as fun to write Flutter apps, but without your various libraries. So personally, from me, thank you for all the work that you've done. Yeah, and I think the chat shows that I speak for everyone. So yeah, we love you, Remy. Thank you.
I love you all too. It's really nice writing packages for everyone. It's a very interesting learning experience.
Yeah. Oh, Hans, yeah, great. I'd love to see you in Stockholm. So everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. This was an awesome deep dive into macros. At least I thought so. Do remember that things are in flux. If you want to put on your Remy hat and start writing a macro in your app, you need to be very lucid about the fact that you are taking on the risk of sudden and unexpected breakages. Things might just stop working. There is no contract around the API. Things are still moving. When there's problems, they get fixed. Those fixes can be breaking changes. That is the state of macros. And if that sounds okay to you, if and only if, then you can start playing around with macros. If you do, your feedback is super valuable, but just know that you are in a bizarro land sandbox. Nothing's real. And that is what it is. And you'd certainly have to be on the master channel as well, I suspect. So, all right. That'll be, I think, it for today. Everyone, I am off next week because I'm going to be in India for IO Connect, and then we'll be back the week after that. And I've already got a guest lined up, well-known face, and it's going to be, I think, another fun conversation. So everyone, I will see you all in 2 weeks.